Hello U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 1, Causes of the Great Depression. As we talked about before, the 1920s are a huge decade of consumer spending. Americans are making more money at their jobs, so they have more disposable income. And disposable income is where you have money left over for the things that you want after you spend money on things you need. So after you pay your bills, you've got money to go out and buy things that you want. Not only this, but we see the rise of more products being made using Henry Ford's assembly line. So you can make new and awesome inventions for cheaper and much quicker. So because of all of this, the economy looks really healthy on the surface. Everything looks great, everybody's happy. And while income does increase in the 1920s, there are some really severe economic issues underneath that surface. This is where Charles Dickens' quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," really applies to the 1920s. Because on the surface, everything looks like it's great, but underneath, everything's really not as good as it seems. In October of 1929, the Roaring Twenties comes to what appears to be an abrupt end, and the Great Depression begins. But why? If everything looks so good and people are making all this money and you're being able to buy all this awesome stuff that's being advertised on the radio, why does the depression happen? There are actually several reasons, and that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. The first one we need to look at is overproduction and underconsumption. Overproduction means that because of those assembly lines, these companies are making so many new things that their inventory is too much. They have too much of that product. Underconsumption means that not enough people are buying it. So too much inventory, not enough buyers. And by the end of the 20s, factories are just producing way too many durable goods. They're making things to last. The quality is really good. So if you buy a car in 1924, you're probably not going to need a new one for several years. Things were made to last. So people aren't having to go out and buy, a new car every 5 years. Or new appliances every 6 or 7 years. And this is known as overproduction. You're making too much of the product. And people did not need as many appliances or cars or furniture by the end of the decade because it was made to last and things were good. This is called underconsumption. Too much product, not enough buyers. Problems for the farming industry also are a really big deal. The end of World War I leads to a decline in the demand for agricultural products. During the war, America itself is not really fighting the war, like on our homeland. So we're ramping up production of food to be able to not only feed our soldiers, but feed our allies' soldiers. And during the war, the government was ramping up production of food. So during World War I, there's not a lot of competition from European nations because they're fighting the war on their own land. And so the government actually tried to get farmers to produce more during the First World War. And so this leads to more and more farmers taking out loans to buy more land so that they could plant more crops, and also buy new and specialized equipment that's going to help them to better harvest their crops. Well, after the war's over, we don't need that anymore. We're no longer feeding our troops and our people at home and our allies. We're just feeding really our people at home. And in the 1920s, a decline comes for agricultural products, which leads to crop prices falling by 40%. So if a farmer could get $1 per bushel of wheat during the war, after the war's over, they're only getting 60 cents per bushel. So the profits for farmers are decreasing. They're going down. Because of this, farmers can't afford to pay back their loans. And if you don't pay your loan, the bank takes your stuff. And so that a lot of the farms were foreclosed upon, which means basically the bank took those farms away from those people. Not only that, but railroads, textiles, and the coal industry were losing money because they're facing competition from cars and synthetic fabrics and natural gas, which is a huge issue because all these newfangled inventions and such are putting other industries that used to be really big out of business. We also see a really big rise in American debt in the 1920s. Many Americans start using credit for the first time. Buy now, pay later kind of concept, where you put a down payment on something and then you pay out payments in an installment plan, which is what a lot of Americans now do. But this leads to a lot of people living beyond their means, really buying things that they can't actually afford. This generates large debt, and debt is when you owe money to somebody else. So by the end of the decade, many Americans really have to cut back on their spending. In 1921, for example, the average savings per year is $576. In America, that's how much the average person or average household is saving. The average debt is $4,936. So that's not a huge savings to debt difference. By 1929, wages have gone up, the economy is growing. Many households are saving about $1,600 per year. But compared to the $10,500 in debt that each American household is occurring on average, the savings to debt ratio has grown significantly. And that's because so many people in the 20s are buying on credit. They're putting a down payment and paying it off in payments. So the average annual savings is going up, but so is the average annual debt. People owe more money by the end of the decade. So how does this compare to today? Granted, this chart is a little over 10 years old, but it gives you a good picture of historical debt ratios versus modern debt ratios, and this has more than likely significantly risen over the last decade. So, debts soar with rising house prices, historically low rates, and increased access to credit. Only 1/4 of households in America by 2008 have no debt. 1/4 of Americans by 2008 have no debt. Home ownership rises nearly 70%. In the 20s, not a lot of people are owning their own houses. They're mostly renting. And in the 2000s, 2/3 of college students have student loan debt. That's a lot. There wasn't really any student loan debt in the 20s. And then 40% of American households in the 2000s have a credit card balance. Credit cards don't exist in the 20s. We're barely getting installment plans. So the average debt in 1929 is about $10,500. In 2008, the average savings is approximately $392 on average, but the debt is $117,951. Most American households are not even saving $400 a month, a year, but yet your average debt is well over $115,000. Significantly up from that $10,000, and that $10,000 was adjusted for inflation to modern times. As you can see, debt has just significantly increased over the last 100 years. The next issue is uneven distribution of wealth. The decade was not nearly as wealthy as it appeared. We've got rising wages, we've got better jobs, but the gap between rich and poor really grows significantly in the 20s. 70% of Americans were considered poor. 70%. If you look at the chart here, the yellow is people who make $1,999 or less per year. Even in the 1920s, the minimum income that would be considered a decent living was $2,500 a year. 65% of Americans are under $2,000 per year. The blue represents the next bracket up from $2,000 to $4,999. That's the bracket where people are starting to make a comfortable living to where they can support their families and have a little bit of disposable income. The orange and the green are people who are making between $5,000 and $10,000 or more. That's 30% of the population. 30% of the population is doing majority of the spending because so few people are actually living where they can be comfortable. And this is honestly where a lot of that buy now, pay later stuff works out, is they don't have the money to buy it outright because they barely make enough to be able to pay their bills. So this idea of credit, and I can have the really nice things, but I can pay it out as I go, becomes very appealing to the other 70% that are considered poor. And then we get to stock market speculation. The stock market soars throughout the 20s, and people speculated by essentially using credit to buy stocks, borrowing money to pay for stocks. And this is called buying on margin. So let's say you buy $100 in stocks. You're going to put a 10% down payment, so $10, and then you're going to pay that off in payments, just like you would do with a car or an appliance or a radio. But the difference is a lot of people are watching those stocks so that when the price goes up a lot, they're going to sell that stock, make the profit, pay off their debts, and then do it again. It becomes a cycle. And the stock market is not regulated. The government doesn't really keep an eye on how things are going, which allows some companies to actually alter their values. Basically meaning what they're showing it's worth isn't really what it's worth. And this causes those companies to increase their profits. This creates what's called a bubble. And you'll learn much more about this when you take an economics class. I am not an economist, so I'm not going to go into detail because I do not want to tell you wrong information. But I can tell you this significantly changes the stock market and it becomes a really big problem. The spark that triggers the Great Depression is the stock market crash in 1929. And this is not something that just all of a sudden happens. This is just when that bubble that we just talked about bursts. On October 29th, 1929, which is what we call Black Tuesday, the stock market crashes. And it had had a few small crashes prior to this within the week before, but this is the really big one. People start rushing to sell their stocks because they want to try to make any money they could possibly back. Because pretty much all these people are buying on margin. They're buying on credit. And the stock market drops significantly. Prices plummet. And investors lose a total of $30 billion. Speculators who bought on margin can now not pay off their debts. So if you just put $10 down, you still owe $90. But the stock market just crashed and the price of your stock went from $100 to 10 or to 5 or to 1. When you sell that stock, if you can, it's not worth anything now. Because, well, you bought on margin, guys. Stock market crash, prices plummet. You got to take what you can get. And so many people literally lose everything that they have because they made bad investment choices. So what we're going to look at right now is a video that might help explain it a little bit and give you an idea of really what that panic looked like.
Somehow it didn't last forever. The time came when the ticker tape in the broker's office told a new story. It was panic. 16.5 million shares of stock sold in a single day. Sold hopelessly, desperate, at any price. It was the forerunner of depression and crisis. That same winter, the richest country in the world began a bitter journey downhill. The stock market buckled and crashed. The nation's economy plummeted into the depression. By 1932, nearly 1 man out of 4 was unemployed. Working men spent their days on park benches. The government set up public soup kitchens. New York, the richest city in the richest country in the world, found itself bankrupt, politically as well as economically.
After the crash, people tried to withdraw their money from the banks. But the banks couldn't produce any money because in some cases, in a lot of cases, the banks were using people's money to invest in the stock market. So the bank literally did not have the people's money to give them. And when the banks couldn't produce their money, the banks failed. This led to a run on banks across the United States as many people started hearing the news that the banks didn't have the money. The people were trying to get there as quickly as they could to try to salvage as much from their bank accounts as they could. Hundreds of banks fail and thousands of people lose their entire life savings. And this is why even in modern society, people from this generation don't trust the banks. For my great-grandmother's entire rest of her life, she really didn't trust the banks very much because she had lost $18 in the stock market crash. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot to us, but when you come from a very poor farming family, that's equivalent to around like $125, $150 today. That's a lot of money to me that I would be upset to lose. And she told us into her 90s about how she lost $18 in the stock market crash. That was a big deal to her throughout the rest of her life, as it was to hundreds of thousands of other Americans. And the banking failure and stock market crash lead to the collapse of thousands of businesses across the country. And this is the beginning of the over decade-long era that we call the Great Depression. This will bring us to the end of Unit 5, Lesson 1, Causes of the Great Depression. Thank you, and see you back here for Unit 5, Lesson 2. Have a great day.